Good morning. Norton A. Schwartz serves as president and CEO of the Institute for Defense Analysis, IDA, a nonprofit organization cooperating in the public interest. IDA manages 3 federally funded research and development centers that answer the most challenging U.S. security and science policy questions with objective analysis, leveraging extraordinary scientific, technical, and analytic expertise. At IDA, General Schwartz, U.S. Air Force, retired, directs the activities of more than 1,000 scientists and technologists employed by IDA. General Schwartz has had a long and prestigious career of service and leadership that spans over 5 decades. He was most recently president and CEO of Business Executives for National Security, or BENS. During his 6-year tenure at BENS, he was also a member of IDA's Board of Trustees. Prior to retiring from the U.S. Air Force, General Schwartz served as the 19th Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force from 2008 to 2012. He previously held senior joint positions as Director of the Joint Staff and the Commander of U.S. Transportation Commands. He began his service as a pilot with the airlift evacuation out of Vietnam in 1975. General Schwartz is a U.S. Air Force Academy graduate and holds a master's degree in business administration from Central Michigan University. He's also an alumnus of the Armed Forces Staff College and the National War College. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a 1994 Fellow of Massachusetts Institute of Technology Seminar 21. General Schwartz has been married to Susie since 1981. Please join me in warmly welcoming General Schwartz.
Good morning, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to come chat. I thought what we might do is talk a little bit about the essence of foreign affairs and then another subject that might be of interest to some of the technically oriented people here in the room, drones. You know, America's security depends on many manifestations of national power. The economy is clearly foremost, as no nation has ever fielded a significant military capability without a well-performing economy. There are reputational, informational, cultural, and alliance aspects of national power as well. But regarding military power and the security of the nation, it's a function of basically 3 things: capacity, how much; quality, how good and how much overmatch over competitors; and perceptions of the will to employ that precious national asset. Capacity and quality are largely a function of the resources a nation commits to organizing, training, and equipping its military forces. In our country, when and how to employ that asset is a political choice made by civilian leadership with best military advice. Perhaps we should talk more about that in the Q&A. Over time, there are 2 overarching themes characterizing America's employment of military power. First are those who believe that peace and security are reinforced by employing military power for both goals of national survival and to drive desired political outcomes. The second theme is those who believe that peace and security derive more from a limited use of military power for matters approaching national survival only. One might oversimplify the point by assigning names to these 2 perspectives. The more limited perspective would be Rand Paul. The more maximalist perspective would perhaps be Josh Bolten. I doubt anyone here would contest the use of military power to assure national survival. our maintaining a nuclear triad has sustained deterrence in this context for many decades. One can debate, we certainly can, how many nuclear weapons we should possess, or what means we might use to deliver them to their targets with confidence. But the fundamental notion propelling deterrence theory is national survival. It is, however, the non-nuclear general purpose conventional forces where the debate about size and what composition the force should have predominate. Land versus maritime versus air versus space versus cyber. All of these elements. And of course, as many of you know, and perhaps you have some aspirations for, we now have a space force. I doubt anyone here would contest the use of military power to protect the homeland. It was air defense in the 50s and 60s against the Soviet bomber threat. Missile defense now against credible emerging threats from North Korea, among others. Even the immediate response to the incubator of jihadism in the Afghan-Pakistan border region in 2001. And clearly, humanitarian efforts mitigating the events that routinely occur due to catastrophic but generally naturally occurring events like typhoons, hurricanes, and tsunamis and the like. But for all of you, the question is, what about wars of choice, or at least discretionary uses of military power? Do we intervene in the Indian-Pakistani contest in Kashmir? Do we follow those who promote regime change and accept the inevitable risks and consequences involved? Do we defend Taiwan? Do we offer assurances of extended deterrence with our nuclear capabilities in order to minimize the likelihood of proliferation of otherwise capable allies? Do we defend Saudi Arabian oil production infrastructure? Do we punish Iran if they conduct a strike on Saudi oil production infrastructure? All of these are profound questions for national policy and strategy, ultimately, again, defined by the civilian leadership of our country. But at the highest level of grand strategy, do we act or aspire to act based on principle? Promises given some many decades ago, lasting friendships between nations, pure self-interest, personal pique, or some fairly clear definition of national purpose. Having outlined these few thoughts to provoke your interest and perhaps discussion later, please allow me now to make a few comments on what I would call remote warfare. Over the centuries, y'all, the distance between combatants has grown from knives and swords to black powder weapons, to mortars and artillery, to aircraft-delivered weapons, and now digits via the internet. A relatively new development is the use of remotely piloted aircraft to engage the enemy, and I think it deserves some elaboration for you all. I submit that U.S. employment of strike-capable remotely piloted aircraft is a viable and rational response to a complicated battlefield problem. It is clearly one that must be calibrated and used with care, but nonetheless, it is one that allows us to pursue our objectives in a fashion that minimizes the loss of life for friendly forces and non-combatants that is consistent with the laws of armed conflict. Simply, remotely piloted aircraft systems permit more considered and accurate, and as a result, more proportionate application of lethal force than any other comparable weapon system. Because they spend a longer amount of time in the air than equivalent manned aircraft, they give their operators the time to maximize the certainty. Not absolute certainty, but certainty that they are engaging the right target, and the persistence and the means to minimize the presence of non-combatants near the intended target. Thoughtful observers, perhaps some of you here in the audience, have raised several criticisms, both of remotely piloted aircraft and U.S. use of them. Let me address several of the most common reservations. According to Peter Singer from the Brookings Institution, the absence of physical risk to the operator encourages America's political leadership to use remote systems more frequently than they otherwise would had they had to put American troops at physical risk. I would counter by asking you this question: whether those who use this argument would prefer that American military absorb casualties just for the purpose of making war less attractive to the political leadership. In addition, at the tactical level, it is the ability of remote systems to maintain surveillance in the target area, with remote operators carefully and deliberately evaluating those targets against the criteria allowing them to shoot. And it is that makes remotely piloted aircraft so discriminating and effective. Soldiers and airmen on the ground are far more likely to shoot back at sources of fire aimed at them, with greater danger to non-combatants, than are remote operators whose lives are not immediately threatened. There's also concern that other states and perhaps non-state actors will use these technologies and use them against us, clearly in a more crude and indiscriminate fashion than we do, and indeed they have. You see, the means of delivery really is a side discussion, provocative though it is, to the fundamental matter of the legitimacy of the target and how precisely that target is engaged. Ladies and gentlemen, all loss of life and property destroyed must approximate the military advantage that is gained by executing the mission. This is the standard adhered to in manned and remote system operations alike. The distinctive advantage of remote systems, however, is that they offer high levels of discrimination due to very long periods of unbroken surveillance, precision weapon delivery, and exquisite timing that allows for significant risk mitigation for non-combatants. Allow me to conclude with these few one-liners. Remote systems offer persistent surveillance enabling precise targeting. When armed, they dramatically compress the observe, decide, strike timeline. Remote operations also reduce our forward military footprint and therefore the vulnerability of our troops. And finally, remotely piloted aircraft do offer cost advantages in comparison to roughly equivalent manned aircraft. In short, the drama and debate over drones isn't really about the platform. It is less about that tool than it is the rigor and the legitimacy of the targeting methodology we employ on the battlefield. I offer to you today that this relatively new weapon system is used carefully in accordance with the laws of our armed conflict, and that capabilities of remote systems, in fact, allow national leaders in the military chain of command to adhere more closely to those laws and procedures than is the case for less discriminating systems that they may in part replace. Let me conclude with this one thought. While you might have misgivings, I am an example of someone who has been fortunate to lead a career of public service. The country needs good people in public service. I recommend that each of you consider the nobility of a career of public service as you formulate your career aspirations. I appreciate your attention this morning, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow and any of your questions. Thank you very much.